farm. So here we see the turbines, which are connected to each other by inter-array cables, and then connected to the offshore substations also by the inter-array cables. The offshore substation is sort of where the energy gets harnessed until it's ready to be brought to shore via an offshore export cable. The offshore export cable then becomes an onshore export cable and then connects to the onshore substation, and then the power is distributed to homes and businesses. So the federal permitting requirements. This slide gives you an overview of what the federal permitting requirements are for an offshore wind farm. Just a high level overview. This ranges from everything from NEPA requirements, EPA requirements, quite a few BOEM requirements. But today we're really focusing on the SAP, the Site Assessment Plan, and the COP, the Construction and Operations Plan. And these are submitted to BOEM for approval by BOEM. And so BOEM is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. It's a part of the U.S. Department of the Interior, responsible for the regulation of renewable energy, oil and gas, marine minerals, and environmental assessments on the U.S. Outer Continental Shelf. So while these projects are connecting on into different states and driven by state policies, there's still a significant federal permitting process because they are offshore outside of state waters on those, yes. And so the SAP and the COP. Once a developer is issued a lease area by BOEM, they'll then begin planning to deploy a meteorological buoy within their lease area in order to understand the conditions within the lease area. So this buoy will collect data on wind, waves, temperature, and other necessary parameters. In order to deploy this buoy, the developer must submit a SAP, a site assessment plan. And so this plan will describe all of the activities that go into deploying and operating the buoy, as well as any resources that may be impacted by the buoy. So BOEM wants to see that the developer has a full understanding of the baseline conditions of the resources, any impacts that might happen to those resources, and what the developers' proposed mitigation measures are to limiting those impacts. The resources that are supported by geophysical survey are the anthropogenic conditions and hazards and the physical and oceanographic conditions. And then we have the COP, the Construction and Operations Plan. So while the SAP must be submitted within 1 year of receiving a BOEM lease area, the COP must be submitted within 5 years. And that's because the COP is a much larger, much more involved document. The COP describes all of the activities that go into installing an offshore wind farm, operating, and later decommissioning an offshore wind farm. And then it has a much more thorough assessment of all of the resources that could be impacted. There's a lot more potential resources that could be impacted because this is a document for the entire project. So the offshore portions, the offshore cable route, and the terrestrial portions. Whereas the SAP is a document for just that tiny spot where the buoy is going to go. Similar to the SAP, BOEM wants to see that the developer has a full understanding of the baseline conditions of all of these resources, all of the potential impacts that could happen to them, what the results of those impacts would be, and what the developer is proposing to mitigate those impacts. Again, the resources that relate to geophysical survey are the physical and oceanographic conditions and marine archaeology. So this slide provides an example development timeline for an offshore wind project. We almost didn't include this slide because the timeline doesn't exactly match up with what we've talked about, right? So we see a SAP being approved in 2016 and a COP being submitted in 2020, whereas I just told you that they needed to be submitted within 1 and 5 years. But what likely happened here was that the developer requested an extension and BOEM granted that extension. So we included this to really give you an idea of just how extensive the permitting process is and how long this takes. And now I'm going to pass things off to Marcus for the geophysical survey.
Oh, thank you, Corey. We've hit the point where we know what BOEM are, and we know that there are some federal requirements and that survey will inform these critical SAP and COP documents. So why are we doing survey again? Well, because BOEM have told us to, and if we don't get our SAP and COP approved, we can't build our wind farm. And the drivers kind of within BOEM are for this responsible development, for both economically and environmentally responsible development, as well as picking up some other federal requirements for archaeology. They're particularly interested in geohazards, and the survey will also provide a reconnaissance for everyone and a baseline potentially for comparison going forward. Potentially there'll be follow-up impact surveys year on year through the life of the project. And worth noting, although we're not specifically covering it in this talk, if you have to do a survey sufficient to meet the requirements of the SAP and the COP, you might as well try and get as much of your engineering information out of it simultaneously rather than look at separate mobilizations. So the developer will usually have additional requirements supplementary or complementing the SAP and COP goals, which are summarized in 2 guidance documents for the areas that we're interested, the geophysical survey, one for geophysical, geotechnical and geohazard information, and one for the archaeology. These are about 50 pages of documentation and guidance between them, and they're varyingly comprehensive on various things. So we're going to have to do some survey, and as Corey showed in the earlier slide, so far we've mostly concentrated on the East Coast. If you can see, the coloured blocks are 3-mile survey blocks, and the kind of grey areas are smaller sub-blocks, where we've got quite a geographical range north-south now. Water depths, where, as you can see on the pretty extensive shelf, so usually less than 40 meters. I think the deepest tip out there is about 60 meters. We're fairly close inshore, but outside of state waters. And these are all together generating some pretty big surveys, which we'll talk about a little more on the next slide. Thanks, Corey. Can you click onto the next slide?
The next one, Marcus?
Yes, please. So, oh, I think we skipped one there. Thank you. So, honing in on just one wind farm example, this is coastal Virginia offshore. You can see we've got an area with lots of turbines, as Corey said, hundreds depending on the size of the wind farm. This one, or at least at this level of the planning in green, the green dots, they have 3 substations, and it's not too easy to pick out, but you can see a cable route extending ashore. And the main drivers in turn generate the key data requirements. So there isn't a huge amount of publicly available data, or there's variable publicly available data. There is some, but you're going to want a pretty comprehensive set of survey, and that's what BOEM wants, and BOEM want the developer to want. So we're going to be going out there for bathymetry data to get good chartable depths for construction. It's sort of a myriad of purposes. From both the bathymetry and other sensors, we're going to be picking up seabed characterization. We're going to be looking subseabed because we're going to be installing things into and below the seabed. And we're going to be using magnetic methods to specifically pick up some anthropogenic items, usually the larger ones in particular. There's a BOEM onus to locate in-service pipelines and cables. Next slide, please. So we're going to have to mow a lot of lawn survey-wise. These areas are quite large, as is, I think, traditional for these talks. I did a quick back of the envelope, how many line kilometers of survey data are there, and I came up with about 145,000 miles, as is also traditional. I then compared that distance to some obscure but large distances, but sadly, it's not a very interesting percentage of distance to the moon. It's about 60%. It is, however, about equivalent to 6 circumnavigations of the equator. My wife assures me 3 Toyota Corolla clutches, 45 Atlantic crossings, 1,500 days at the usual survey speed of 3.5 to 4 knots, which doesn't give you any weather downtime, port calls, or anything else. And so overall, a pretty huge amount of survey. And this is driven by individual requirements within the BOEM guidelines, which I've generally summarized here. Overall, they're most interested in the wind energy generating area, and they are also interested in the cable route, although the requirements there are not for hugely extensive survey. There's a requirement to both mow the lawn and throw in some tie lines. One of the key drivers people from this group will presumably be interested in is the bathymetry, which is basically IHO special order or 1A, depending on water depth. Unfortunately, it looks like the latest BOEM guidance missed the update to the S44 standards there. But these requirements are not particularly strenuous or not particularly difficult to achieve. There are a few other tweaks that they want in terms of resolution. For side scan sonar, there's an emphasis on object detection. They want 100% overlap or 200% coverage, whichever confusing way you'll say it. They make some specifications about the size of the deliverables you'll have to get and the size of the objects they're interested in. They do want sub-bottom and magnetometer, but only at a fairly coarse 150-meter line spacing, and with the mag at below 6 meters. It's worth emphasizing that this is not a UXO survey, and I threw that little picture in the bottom right there of a fishing boat that did encounter some UXO in the UK recently, because that is an ongoing legacy risk, both in the UK and on the east coast of the US. So there will be UXO survey requirements as part of wind farms, but these are not particularly detailed in the 2 documents we're looking at. And then last but not least, because it sort of in a way overrides everything, for archaeology they want a 30-meter line spacing. So no matter how good your multi-beam is and how much coverage you could pick up per swath, you'll typically end up down at about a 30-meter line spacing, or shallow or narrower than that in shallow water. Thanks, Corey. Next slide. So in order to hoover up this diverse set of data, you will need some survey equipment. BOEM, it's worth noting, although they write the specs that certainly favor some equipment, don't really call out any by name. There are what I would call some industry standards seeming to appear, or at least industry preferences. We'll need multi-beam echo sounders and the usual support equipment to hoover up this multi-beam. Dual heads seem quite popular. The side scan sonar requirements are not particularly hard to meet with the kind of standard industry software. systems. Subsea beds, they do want a kind of dual approach of both a high frequency and a more what they call medium penetration or multi-channel seismic. The key requirement there is to get information down to below the depth that you're going to put things into the seabed, which for a typical monopile, I think, is about 10 or 15 meters. It depends on the size of the turbine. And then on the cable route, if you're trenching in, you might have a couple of meters of disturbance of the seabed there. So that gives you an idea of the depth of penetration requirements. It's moderately deep, but not oil and gas deep. Then for ferrous object detection, magnetometer or usually a fairly simple TVG approach. And we said we wouldn't cover, or we didn't intend to cover geotechnics too much in this talk, but grab sampling is sometimes done to support at this stage, and there is a more detailed set of requirements for coring and boring, which we won't cover. Thanks, Corey. Now that equipment is quite heavy and it's hard to swim out that far offshore with it. So just for information, there's a representative sample of survey boats, mostly scalped from marine traffic. I would love to say I went and looked at it last week and these are all the boats out there, but only one of these was. These are other vessels that I'm just aware of, have done winch farm work in at least the last few years. They take a fairly common shape of a wheelhouse, a big flat deck to put lots of equipment on. Sizes usually about 150 to 300 feet, and they're equipped with everything you'd expect for quite wide-ranging geophysical survey, winches, A-frames, side poles for the equipment that needs to be in the water all the time. And because of where the survey areas are, we're typically looking at ideally week-long durations, quite significant crews out there. And worth noting that because the survey has to come all the way into the beach, there will usually be a small component, or larger for some survey areas around Nantucket in particular, that need to be completed with a smaller nearshore vessel. Thanks, Corey. Next slide. So after reading the spec, creating your line plan, assembling your equipment and mounting it on a suitable vessel, you're going out there, you're collecting data quite merrily, you're collecting large volumes of data on the orders of kind of hundreds of gigabytes per day, depending on what settings, equipment you're using. And then usually you'll want to start processing pretty quickly. Corey will cover the kind of data deliverables in much more detail. None of these are particularly surprising, but you'll want to provide geotiffs, XYZ data, contours, segwise, and then start doing some basic interpretation and feeding all this data towards the large amounts of reporting, which Corey will talk about now. So that's it from me, and back to you, Corey.
Thank you. Okay, so we are on to the marine site investigation report component. So this is where that geophysical survey data gets put into a document that supports the permitting process. So the marine site characterization of a offshore wind farm area consists of a lot of phases, right? Desktop studies, seabed exploration, which Marcus just talked about, some geotechnical survey, and all of that results in the marine site investigation report. The requirements for the reporting for the COP and the SAP are essentially the same, but since the COP is a much larger area, we are going to talk about things in terms of the COP today. So within the guidance documents that Marcus linked from BOEM, there are guidance on the Marine Site Investigation Report, and we use this document when we are reviewing MSIRs to make sure that we are checking all the boxes that BOEM wants to see. So while these are just guidance documents, they really list out what BOEM wants to see, and we make sure that we are hitting all of the key parts. So this includes really basic things like the lease numbers, the block numbers that Marcus talked about, min and max water depths, geographic area map, personnel and equipment details. So this includes the accuracies of all the sensors, a vessel diagram showing the sensor offsets, summary of field ops, a description of any unusual incidents. So if there was any equipment damage or something that ended up with some weird data, we want the reviewer to understand why that data looks the way it does. A copy of all daily survey logs, a log of vessel speeds, course changes, sea state, weather conditions, things that you're typically recording in your DPRs, but it's good to know ahead of time that BOEM is looking for those, so you want to make sure you're logging it each day. A statement of survey and record quality, and a route position list. And then we get into the real meat of the document, the site conditions and hazard assessment. And so this is where that geophysical data gets interpreted. We want the reader to come away from this part of the report with a full understanding of the geologic conditions within the project area, as well as any hazards that may exist in the project area. And so this could be hazards that may pose a risk to the developer during the installation and operation of the wind farm, but also any hazards that may be impacted by the presence of the wind farm and installation of the wind farm. And so this is a pretty extensive list, and some of these are just checking a box, right? Like volcanic activity, usually that's just a no, and then you move on, but things like bed forms, mobile seabeds, scour, slope stability, anthropogenic hazards. These are things that require a much more thorough assessment, a lot more detail about what exactly the risk is and where it exists in the project. So just some of these are require a much more thorough assessment. And then we have the ground model. So this is not explicitly required by BOEM, but we're definitely seeing developers trending towards using a ground model because it's a really great way to manage and present the data. So a ground model is a 3D representation of the subsurface conditions within the project area. So it's a really great way for the developer to show that they have a thorough understanding of what they're working with below the seabed. And then we have the charting component. And so this is definitely a pretty extensive part of the Marine Site Investigation Report. BOEM wants to see charts at a scale of 1 to 10,000, and that's for each of the categories listed here. So for an average lease area, that is 10 to 20 charts per category listed here, and some of these categories result in multiple subcategories. So we quickly see charting efforts get into hundreds and hundreds of charts. I wanted to include an example of all the charts here, but unfortunately, the MSIR is a confidential part of a COP, and so none of them are publicly available for me to include. What I do have are the CVAL pilot project, formerly VALTAP RAP charts. So CVAL pilot submitted a research activities plan instead of a SAP and included charts with that document, which is publicly available. I want to note that these charts are much more simplified than what we'll see for a COP, a much smaller area, but they do check some of those boxes that BOEM is looking for. So I included them as an example. Here, we can see a lot of the basic charting components that you would typically include, right? A scale bar, BOEM actually wants to see feet and meters, a legend, north arrow, coordination tick marks, an inset map, really the basics, but they're all listed out in BOEM's guidance document. So whenever we receive charts to review, we check to make sure all of those requirements or guidance lines have been met. I also provided a zoomed in view so you can see the directional arrows on these navigation track lines. And then I also included the alignment sheets. These were unfamiliar to me prior to my first offshore wind project. These are charts that follow along the offshore cable route. And so these are 3-panel charts, one panel for bathymetry, one for geologic surface features, and one for the profile view. These charts are not oriented north up like the rest of the charts. They're oriented with the cable route. And so each time the cable changes in direction, so does the orientation of these charts. And then, as Marcus said, we're wanted to provide a little more detail on the data deliverables. This is still a high-level summary of the data that BOEM wants to see, but nothing really unusual here. Pretty much what you would expect to accompany a geophysical survey. As Marcus also noted, there's a lot of data coming from these projects. So the data deliverable component is actually significant, trying to figure out how to package it all up and send it out. We did not include the geotechnical data deliverables here, but if you are interested in finding any more detail on these, it's all listed in BOEM's guidance document. And then we wanted to touch on the Marine Archaeological Resources Assessment, also called the MARA. This document is also appended to the COP and submitted to the developer to inform them of how to write the marine archaeological section of their COP. The Marine Archaeological Resources Assessment, the MARA, is prepared by a qualified marine archaeologist, a QMA. So the survey contractor will pass the data off to the QMA for them to write the MARA. A MARA assesses both the potential historic period sites, so what you would expect, shipwrecks, sunken aircrafts, if you're inshore, maybe the remains of a sunken structure, as well as pre-contact period archaeological sites, so things like paleo landscapes. Then quickly to summarize, today we talked about an overview of the U.S. offshore wind industry as well as the federal permits required to develop an offshore wind farm, a summary of the geophysical survey requirements, and then provided a little detail on the MSIR and the MARA and how those relate to the geophysical survey. And now we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Corey and Marcus. It's certainly, that nice holistic overview certainly provided some nice little kind of bits of information to fill the knowledge gaps that I have up in those areas. Quick question to start off. The alignment sheet looked like it was kind of quite exciting and I'd be interested in finding one in my spare time to have a look at. Are there any available online through the BOEM, or are they sort of also confidential?
So for the alignment sheets accompanying a COP, those are all confidential, but I did link the VOWTAP, CVAL pilot, formerly VOWTAP RAP document within this slideshow. So if that will be passed out, then it's provided here. I can also send that to you. And that has the VOWTAP alignment sheets.
Awesome. Thank you, Corey. Jack Herbert is mastering the questions at the moment. He's just said that there are no other questions so far. If you want to type in any questions now or raise your hand and just ask the question, we can do that. I guess whilst we're waiting, can I just confirm that these high density data sets also get fed to the Army Corps and NOAA for charting purposes?
That's a good question. Marcus, do you know?
That is a good question. I'm not explicitly sure. I assume they might be, but no, that's a good question. I might look into that.
We've got another question as well, just saying, are the slides and recordings of this talk going to be available after? They will be. I didn't manage to hit the record button until a little bit into the presentation. So I think Corey had been speaking for maybe 2 minutes before we hit record. And I think Corey said just then that the slides will be available.
We can definitely pass them off to you, Nick, and you can distribute them.
Excellent. Thanks, Corey. I'll send out an email to attendees later on to let them know how they can access these materials. Just checking for any other questions. That looks like it's all the questions. Once again, thank you so much, Mark. Oh, hang on, here we go. There's another question here from Thomas Rasmussen. Jack, I'll let you jump in and start doing the questions.
Okay, was it Steve Eckert has asked, no, I'm sorry, Thomas has asked, do you have information on if BOEM guidelines will be updated anytime soon with new requirements and deliverables?
So the guidelines were updated in 2020, and I don't have any information on when they intend to update them again, but that was a fairly recent update.
I think those ones lasted about 5 years, so you could maybe reasonably infer they might do it something like that frequency, but I wouldn't bet on it either way.
Okay, and then Steve Everett has asked, is there a point in the future at which developers are required to or will make data available to contribute it to any national data archives? It sort of overlaps with your question, Nick. As far as is this being logged somewhere in a national data archive, presumably for access, public access?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one, but it's a really good question. I'll definitely look into it.
I'm not either, and I saw some familiar NOAA names in the attendee list. I'm not sure if they're still with us or care to chime in, but I suppose we'll find out one way or the other. Okay, so Marcus Kwasek has asked, as Corey and Marcus have both said, the data is confidential, so it is up to the owner of distribution. Well, that makes sense. I was kind of wondering about that, given the price of some of these contracts, how generous they're going to be with sharing that data they're paying for. Are there any other questions or comments? Here we go. Okay, Nick Wells says, I believe that for more often than not, developers will provide their survey data to NOAA, etc., but not until the data is reclassified as not being proprietary to their project development processes. That also makes sense. The distance for, I'm sorry, this is EJKAL. I'm sorry, it's in all caps. If that's, if I've somehow misconstrued your name, I apologize. The distance for transit and field activities are quite large. Are developers planning for field verification of potential hydroacoustic impacts on marine mammals during survey activities?
There are protected species observers and a whole NOAA requirement in terms of protected species and marine mammals.
Yeah, I think the key controls there are the IHA incidental harassment authorization, which we didn't cover in this talk. And I think specifically for field verification, my impression is that for various reasons that largely hasn't been done, but I'm vaguely aware of a few cases where people have kind of hung hydrophones around survey boats and gotten real data. But I think the key mitigations kind of remain PSO and observers, which do vary depending on location and the species. But that's something some of our colleagues are very interested in, but unfortunately not, I think, in either Corey or Mai's exact wheelhouse.
Okay. All right. I don't want to leave anyone out. If anyone else has anything to ask or contribute, please feel free to type it in the chat window. Or
I also just want to say that feel free to email Marcus and I with any questions that you think of after this call.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Let's see. Nick, I think I'll just pass it back to you.
Thank you, Jack, for fielding these questions. And once again, thank you, Corey and Marcus, for your time today. And for everyone who attended, we will send out an email with the details about how to rewatch this presentation or access the slides that we are provided with. I'd like to ask anyone from the New England area to stay behind for a quick little chapter meeting and ask everyone else to log off at this time. Thank you again.